Hello, and welcome to Ben Yo Chats. If you're curious about the world, this show is for you. What should we be aware of about the potential harm of international aid and skeptical of its good? Why should an overweight to long-termist thinking based on expected value and utility theory potentially drive us off the rails? On this episode, I speak to philosopher Larry Temkin. Larry, in my view, is one of our great living moral philosophers, and this is a two-part podcast to chat about some of Larry's views in depth. Larry has major works examining inequality and the notion of transitivity for moral choices, as well as his most recent book published in 2022 that critiques certain notions of effective altruism, in particular around ideas of international aid, and some disquiet on the focus on a certain type of long-termism. These ideas may seem a little esoteric, and there is a popular notion that academic moral philosophers can sit in their armchairs and debate the meaning of words to no point. But I think you should bear with us, and if you're tempted, go and investigate some of the underlying works and ideas. In brief, the work on inequality has been very influential on how access to healthcare is viewed, and especially at the World Health Organization, and it likely influenced how China has made healthcare access policy. It highlights how complex inequality can be. The work on transitivity is a unique set of arguments. Transitivity underpins axioms that support many types of economic theory, such as expected value and utility theory, so they might cause us to question the strength of some of our fundamental models of human choice making. Lastly, I view effective altruism, or EA, as one of the most influential positive impact philosophies to have emerged in the last 10 to 15 years. And so to understand that, and also understand where its assumptions may be flawed, I view as important. And Larry is someone who's changed his mind on some of these ideas, but in good faith is still grappling with how to be good in a world of need. If you're only interested in EA, you can skip this episode and go straight to part 2. I hope these episodes stimulate your thinking. Thank you, be well, and enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be speaking to Larry Temkin. I told my friend I'm going to be podcasting with Larry, and they replied, he is a genius. Now, this assertion, I think, rests on Larry's work on inequality and so-called transitivity, and in particular, the work on inequality might have been very impactful on thinking around the importance of access to healthcare. Reading Larry's work for me has made me think quite hard about how to live a good life, especially living in a rich nation, and questioning some of the assumptions behind certain aspects of effective altruism. Larry's books have also led me to question how much weight we can put on using expected value decision-making tools, especially for moral questions. For those of you on video, this is a copy of one of his books, and this is a copy of another one of his books. So I would suggest you get them, Being Good in a World of Need and Rethinking the Good. And I just realized on Rethinking the Good just today that that is the lollipop analogy on the front page there, which I hadn't twigged until today. So I'm feeling, I don't know whether slightly clever or not clever for only realizing that. So Larry, welcome.
Well, thanks, Ben. It's great to finally meet you. We've been talking about doing this for some months now, and it's great that this is finally happening. And I have to say, as long as you were kind enough to hold that up, you cut off half of the picture. So I'm going to hold it up a little bit higher. And the reason for that is the cover of this was actually drawn by my daughter. And so I love that, that she did that. She asked me, can I do the cover of your next book? And I said, sure. But you're right, it is the lollipop example, which is a seminal example in that book. Anyway, great pleasure to meet you and to be talking with you today, and I hope it is enjoyable for your audience.
Excellent. So I'm going to start with an easy one. This is a joke. How should we value a human life? Can we put a dollar figure on it? And when should we or should we not? And I have an example in mind. So here in the UK, we have a National Health Service, and this health service has to make judgments. And broadly speaking, there is a set of people and policymakers who have decided that if a life-saving treatment costs more than about £30,000 for a life year, technically a good quality life year, they will pay for it. But if it costs more than £30,000 for a life year, then they are minded not to pay for it because they can do other treatments which would be saving a life for under £30,000. And so they decide this way for most treatments, such as a diabetes treatment or a migraine treatment or something like that. However, they also make some notable exceptions. And two of these exceptions, which are quite notable for me, are for rare genetic diseases and also for premature babies. Here, treatments for that, under most reasonable assumptions, cost much more than £30,000 per life year, particularly for premature babies, where you can easily get into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. But one of the arguments given is that there is society preference, not by everybody, but by quite a lot of people, and in the majority of people, it seems, when they've done this work, to help premature babies because there is no other treatment for them. So that's a kind of practical example about thinking about this and how you go about valuing a human life and some of these problems or challenges which I can touch upon your work. So what do you make of that?
So great question. In fact, I've never been asked that question before, and I don't have any pat answer to pull out for you. But I have a bunch of things to say about this kind of question. So the question of how much is a human life worth? It's not the right question. It's not how I would frame the question, though I realize that societies have to, in essence, answer that question every time, all the time. Not just in the healthcare system, but when you talk about, should you fix roads? Should you fix a curve in a road? How much is it going to cost? How many people are going to drive it? How many people might die if you do or don't do it? These are all sort of, cost benefit analysis type questions of what's it worth for. The questions for me that we have to answer are not an absolute how much is a human life worth, as if there's a single answer, but what are the values that we care about as a society, as individuals, as members of the society, when we think about these questions. So the reason I put it that way is that there are fundamental issues of fairness and justice that come into play here, which stand opposed to, as my work, as you are well aware of certain kinds of questions which the how much is a life worth question push us towards, which is a kind of cost benefit analysis. How do we get the most bang for the buck? It seems it's inefficient to spend a lot of money to save an infant or to save someone at the end of their lives if it's going to cost, millions of pounds to do so, when you could take those same millions of pounds in theory and spend it in lots of other ways and save far more people. Doesn't that seem better? Well, the sum total of people who save will be better, yes, but questions about fairness aren't just the same as questions about efficiency. They're not unrelated. There are certain ways in which they are related, but they're not unrelated. And the other question is, the reason why I want to balk at just answering the question the way it's framed is we as a society are constantly being told that we have to make trade-offs between, this costly procedure and this cheap procedure, which affects similar ends, et cetera, et cetera. And I think perhaps we do. But the question really is, when we're asking this question, what is the actual trade-off? Why is it a trade-off between, this person's expensive care in order to save their lives and these people's less expensive care to save their lives, rather than this person's expensive care to save their lives and this person's ability to buy a Learjet and fly down to an island that they own, which is a private island somewhere in the middle of nowhere, blah, 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 blah. When we as societies spend, here in the United States, $1 billion on, our pleasure palaces, which is the arena where our football teams play, or, $1 billion on arenas, or $500 million on arenas where our basketball teams play or our baseball teams play. And you think about all these kinds of issues, these are the trade-offs I really want us to think about. I want us to think about when we ask these questions. We're constantly told we only have a budget, and the budget is this amount, and how should we make these trade-offs between this expensive, health policy and this much less expensive health policy? And if those were literally the only trade-offs in play, I could be moved more to think, well, it's 12 lives with this cheaper, efficient way, and it's one life with this way, blah, blah, blah. But if you tell me, but meanwhile, in the background, there are these massive amounts of, inequalities and excesses, what some people regard as excesses, things that people spend enormous amounts of funds on that actually don't necessarily improve the quality of their life, maybe even at all, but even if it does, maybe perhaps a bad smidge, then I'm not sure that we even should be, taking seriously this question of how do we choose between who lives and who dies in this area, rather than putting pressure elsewhere on, as it were, the economic systems that are forcing us to make these choices while we allow all these other kinds of things to go on in the system. So that's why, if I just say, well, I think a human life is worth this, and so we should, make all our decisions that way, I'm already sort of buying into all the background assumptions, which most of which I actually just reject. So I'm inclined to sort of not answer the question the way it was put, and to want to shift our attention to these other larger questions. But I can enter a philosopher's room where I say all these other things are not there. We don't have vast inequalities, and we don't have people spending hundreds of millions of dollars on giant yachts, and they have 12 homes and so on, and none of that is prevalent. And now we have to make some of these tough choices. And even then, I would decline to say a human life is worth one amount rather than another. I would then still be trying to pay attention to questions of what would be fair, what would be just, how do we give everyone equal opportunities to live, et cetera, et cetera? How should we weight those kinds of considerations? These are more about comparisons than about values than about the absolute value of a human life.
That makes sense. So I pulled two things out of that, although there's quite a lot. One is there's a higher level question as to, maybe I misused the word in terms of pluralism, but thinking about other aspects, both on the systems level, are there other things we should be judging, but also these other ideals of fairness or equality or things like that. I do think there is something, though, that the health authorities, for instance, do in the end have to try and make that decision. But in some ways, you're sort of saying that the philosophy question is perhaps a tier above that.
Well, let me re-enter the question for a second with a concrete case that I discuss in my most recent book, Being Good in a World of Need. So there is a charity called Village Reach, and it's a well-known charity, and it operates throughout the world, but mostly in Africa. And the aim of Village Reach is to reach so-called last mile communities. And the idea is the Village Reach is a charity that recognizes that there are all sorts of very needy people, mostly in rural areas scattered throughout Africa and elsewhere, where there's infrastructure problems, and there's medical personnel problems. There's a whole host of problems that are in play that make it difficult for people who are very ill in these distant rural communities, the so-called last mile communities, to get health care. Now, strikingly, oddly, certain effective altruist organizations such as GiveWell for many years had ranked the Village Reach as one of their top-rated charities as an organization. And what that basically means is that, they judged that the money that you spent in contributing, if you made contribution to Village Reach, was money well spent that was efficiently being used, and that this charity was doing what it said it was doing for the money that you were giving it, and so on. It turns out that for a variety of well-known reasons, that Village Reach is actually intended to counteract. And a charity of this kind is not efficient. It's not efficient if what you want to do is maximize the number of lives saved. And this is what, health organizations like the World Health Organization and many international aid organizations have recognized, because by and large, you can do a lot more good if what you're merely interested in is saving the most lives. If you focus on the cities, the large cities, you put a hospital in a large city, you put a hospital in like a place like Kibera, which is, the largest slum in Africa. And, a single doctor can reach hundreds of thousands of people. Where some of these remote villages, they're in the middle of nowhere, and there's, 100 people in the village or less. And, to send a doctor out there to address the needs of a dying child, it's just not efficient. It's not cost effective. But the point of a charity like Village Reach is to say that the child who's born in rural Africa, their life is just as valuable as the lives of the children that are born in, in the major cities, in Nairobi or wherever else. And they should have an equal chance at life, at having a normal life expectancy. And so this charity has risen up to meet a demand that most of the poor nations of the world, their healthcare systems just can't meet that demand. But the thing to note here is that this is a charity that at its root has a certain conception of fairness in mind. It's not a, how do we do the most good with the money? It's does this child's life matter any less than these children's? And it's with that in mind. And there are deep philosophical backgrounds to this kind of thinking. I mean, Kant famously claimed that each person's life was worth infinite value. Now, that may be too strong, but the point about each person's life is worth infinite value is in essence the view that you don't trade off between lives. You don't say, well, here's one life here and here's two lives here. And, I could save these two people if I'm just willing to kill this person and distribute their organs, and are two lives more valuable than one. And Kant would say, well, each of their lives is infinitely valuable. Each of their lives has value without bound. And you don't increase the total value in the world by killing one innocent person in order to save two others. That's not how we should be guided in our thinking. And I'm not a strict Kantian by any means. I actually give a great weight in my own thinking to so-called consequentialist considerations, the kind of efficiency considerations that motivate organizations like effective altruism and such. I give great weight to it, but that's kind of one important moral ideal, and it has to be balanced against other ideals. And that was the point of my initial response and the point of my talking about places like Village Reach. I think there's a place in our pantheon of valuable charities that will rank something like Village Reach, which is highly inefficient in terms of most life saved for the dollar, but highly efficient in terms of giving weight to a value like equality or fairness.
Sure, that makes sense, and that feels like an analogy to the UK health service issue. And I guess that's made me reflect a little bit on something to do, and you've written about this a little bit as well, the nature of perhaps time and also distance, because there's a little bit on the sense of fairness, I think, particularly with babies, because we feel that they have a future. And there is something about thinking about future selves. And then I think, drawing in the example of a village in Africa, there is something about distance, about perhaps it not being necessarily as morally relevant when we're thinking about weighing lives. And like you say, if you get to the Kant view of it being infinite, then actually things like time and distance fade away. Have you changed your view or thinking about time and distance over your thinking around this?
Not over my thinking around this per se. I think questions about time and distance are historically, people have thought questions about time and distance are philosophically simple, but practically complex. So the thought would be historically that we should be neutral with respect to people. All people's lives are equally valuable. Places, It doesn't matter where in space someone is suffering. What matters is that someone is suffering somewhere, and neutral with respect to time. So if I could save one person alive today, or 500 people who will be alive in 100 years from now, 500 lives, other things equal, more important than one life. This gets into the question we started with. Suppose we take that for a minute. And the fact that it's in the distant future, that doesn't matter. It's 500 versus one. So from a theoretical standpoint, most philosophers and economists and others have agreed that we should be neutral theoretically with respect to people, places, and times. But practically speaking, it can make a big difference whether someone is right next to you or further away. It can make a difference whether you can help someone now or in the future, because someone might need your care now will assuredly die if you don't help them. Someone in the future might die if you help them. They might not even come to exist if you do or don't make certain actions now, or they might come to exist, but there might be technological developments that will enable you to save those 500 people. And the technologies you would have saved, not use the resources here now in order to save them in the future, turn out to be obsolete and aren't even necessary, and so you let this person die for nothing. These are sort of practical considerations. They're not theoretical considerations, they're practical considerations. Now, as a matter of fact, I've come to the view and published a bit that even the theoretical questions are not nearly as simple as most people have thought. That it's just a simple matter of being neutral with respect to people, places, and times. When I say that, there's always a kind of other things equal clause here. So when I say that you ought to be neutral with respect to people, I'm not suggesting that that means that there can't be special relationships. So, you know, between me and my wife, me and my children, me and my mother. But the point is, if there are special relationships that enable me to treat my mother differently than a stranger, then that's supposed to be true for everyone. That's the kind of neutrality I'm talking about here. So if another stranger has a mother, they get to treat their mother the same way I get to treat my mother. That's the sense in which neutrality can be compatible with different people having special obligations or duties towards those that they're in close contact with. But anyway, short, I'm wandering here a little bit, but the thing is, the questions about space and time, neutrality with respect to people, places, and times, people have made a lot of assumptions about these over the years, that we ought to treat these different possible locations of the good the same. We ought to treat time or space or people, they're all the same from a moral standpoint. I've actually published that that's not right. I think that turns out to be extremely complicated, but that would take us down a philosophical rabbit hole probably, which would try the patience of your readers. Yeah. But if your readers are interested in this, they might look at some of my articles where I argue about people, places, and times, and I show that the common assumption that, you know, they're all different locations of the good, we ought to treat them all the same. That's only not only not plausible, it's not even possible in certain kinds of cases. They're actually incompatible with each other.
That seems to be a thread when I follow your work, because it's similar on inequality, that if I were to sum it up, you look at it and go, well, we thought it might have been theoretically simple, but it turns out that actually it's also theoretically complicated. And I'm going to come back to this nearness of people, because it's actually a small point in your book, perhaps, but it really struck me that you make a point about when someone is right in front of you, the immediacy of that moment. I don't know whether there was a certain phrase for it. And that actually struck me as quite true, but that's from my work within theater and art. But we'll come to that because I think it will help understand through the singer's pond analogy when we get to some of the disanalogies on that. So maybe before getting to that, I was maybe going to touch on your work on transitivity. But before touching on that, I was really interested in essentially how you've come about your ideas and how do philosophers think? Because I'm interested in how we as humans, say, progress. And so we can progress technologically, we can progress socially, and I think we seem to progress morally. If you go 1,000 years ago, the consensus was slaves are fine. Come to today, the consensus is slaves are not fine. And I think most people also agree today that's actually some sort of moral or social progress. And some of that could have been come from a moral or philosophical thinking. And I was just rereading the front of your book, and some of your thinking around this area you had quite early on. I think maybe you say 1977 or something like that. And you first propose it to a couple of some of the greatest living at the time moral philosophers, and they basically say doesn't seem to make any sense. And so you park that idea for several years. But there's something about it which you haven't quite let go, and you have a couple of students who reignite it with you, and you come to it again. And it's interesting, and we'll come to this dinner that you have, which I think seems to be one of the greatest, perhaps, moral philosophy dinners of the last 10 or 20 years. But again, you have these thoughts which go around in your head. You can't sleep very easily. You run all of these scenarios. You seem to be almost dreaming about it to come to some sort of conclusion. And it also now seems to be the case, particularly if we think about transitivity, that people who didn't agree with you and people who thought like this is completely crazy are kind of thinking, well, maybe this is truth. Maybe this is some discovery, or at least something we need to take really seriously, which strikes me as some form of progress from something which is a very non-consensus idea has sprung out of your brain somehow and come out into the world. And I'm not sure, is there anything we can think about or learn about this? Maybe we can't because we don't have a good sense of it. But I was really struck how, if this is true about transitivity, and it seems to be a certain true of inequality, and maybe some of these ideas that you've recently expressed, they've gone against the consensus grain, but they've also then maybe allowed us to progress. And there seems to be something quite important about that process upstream. I wondered whether you'd had any reflections on this, or whether you've had time to kind of think like, well, that's interesting. This is an idea which in 1977 might have died and never come to light, in which case actually all of these other downstream effects may not have happened, but actually it did.
Yeah, so this is a great question, Ben. Some of this is just luck. Some of this is just, I couldn't write a prescription for how this happens. I can say several things, which is that, I mean, part of it is just me. Part of it is just, I mean, I remember when I was in 9th grade, I had a high school teacher, and she said to me, "Oh, Larry, you iconoclast, you." And to be honest, I didn't know what that word meant, but I looked it up and I said, yeah, I'm kind of happy with that. Where, for those of you audience members who don't want to have to look it up, I'll just tell you, iconoclast is just like the breaker of idols, right? So I've always had it in me that my favorite expression, my absolute favorite expression is for the bumper sticker that I love is question authority. It's not necessarily disobey authority, but it's always question authority. So in some sense, this is the heart of what philosophers have always done. They question the given, right? I mean, going back to Plato and Plato's cave, here's this world that we're surrounded in, and is it the real world, or are we just seeing shadows on a cave and we don't know the difference? And Kant and Hume and all these great philosophers who have raised all these great skeptical questions, Descartes, how do I know that I'm dreaming and I'm not awake? These are all basically questioning even the most fundamental truths. I mean, the most fundamental truth is like, there's a tree outside my window, or I exist and lots of other people exist, and then people have the problem of other minds. Well, how do I know anybody else exists? How do I know there's any center of consciousness anywhere but here? So part of this is just, as it were, a philosophical tradition that goes back, to the pre-Socratics, to question. And some people have philosophical temperaments and some people don't. And it turns out I'm one of those people who do. I have a philosophical temperament. I've always questioned things. My parents would tell me things, and they tell my siblings things. And I have 3 very bright siblings. So they all have, doctorate degrees or lawyer degrees or whatever. They're very bright. They're very smart. But, I would be questioning everything. And my siblings would say, yeah, okay, that sounds right, So part of the thing is, is having a kind of temperament that allows you to question things and to be open to the possibility that even the things that everybody thinks must be true might still not be true. And I am actually just always open to that possibility. And then there's the element of, as it were, luck or being sparked. In my case, being sparked by a genius, a certifiable genius. I mean, my mentor was Derek Parfit. He was, in my judgment, the great living moral philosopher until the time of his death, not that long ago. One of the great moral philosophers, I believe, since Kant. I mean, he was a towering figure, and I had the great fortune of working very closely with him. And the thing about Derek is he was just utterly brilliant. So you're in the presence of brilliance, and he would create these arguments. He was this argument machine. He would generate all these arguments, and he was so bright, and he was so clever, and he was so smart. And people in the presence of Derek would often just listen to his arguments, and they be blown away and think, wow, man, that's amazing. That must be right. But I just always had this element of, I would read Derek's arguments, and I would often think, well, I can see why he says that, but, and then something in the back of my head would nag at me, and it would just make me want to think about it a little bit different way. And both of the things you're discussing here, and maybe we'll get to the conversation of the dinner, which was quite fun for my third book, but the spark of both of my first two books came from incredibly rich arguments that Derek made, where he made claims, and most people read those claims and just accepted them. And I read those claims, and for whatever reason, I didn't just accept them. I thought, maybe, but maybe not. And so, I mean, the story about the transitivity, I mean, I'll just quickly relay it for your audience. It was the case. Derek had created this incredibly clever argument, which he called the mirror addition paradox. And I won't go into the details of the mirror addition paradox, but the form of the mirror addition paradox is he was considering three different possible futures about where the world would go. And he asked us to judge how these different worlds compared, how these different outcomes, possible outcomes compared. And he considered three of them, and they were called the A world, the A plus world, and the B world. And he gave very powerful arguments for thinking that the A world was better than the B world. And they were very compelling arguments. And then he gave very compelling arguments for the claim that the B world was better than the A plus world. And they were also very compelling arguments. And then he gave this incredibly compelling series of arguments for the view that A plus was not worse than A. But that was a contradiction according to the standard assumptions of what's called the axiom of transitivity for better than, which human beings have accepted more or less since we came down from the trees. Because the thought is, if A is better than B and B is better than C, then A must be better than C. So if A was better than B and B was better than A plus, then A must be better than A plus. But Derek had supposedly had these arguments to show A was better than B and B was better than A plus, but A wasn't better than A plus. And Derek took that to show that we had this, paradox, and we had to figure out which of these various claims had to go. We didn't know which one had to go, but we knew that one of them had to go because they were incompatible with the axiom of transitivity. And this axiom was just accepted without argument for centuries of human thought. I mean, everybody accepts them. Philosophers accept them, psychologists accept them, economists accept them, mathematicians accept them, physicists, everybody accepted them. But the thing is, when I read Derek's arguments, I thought, geez, A really is better than B. And B really is better than A plus. But it isn't clear that A is better than A plus. Maybe the lesson to be learned from the mirror addition paradox is not that we have to give up one of these very plausible claims, but rather that we have to give up the axiom of transitivity. And that entered my head. And the thing is, I was open to that. Nobody else was. Everybody else read that. They had an axiom. They just accepted, axiom of transitivity must be true. And I took this and I went to, as you say, three of the greatest living philosophers at the time. I took this thought, this insight of mine, that maybe the lesson to be learned from the mirror addition paradox was that all things considered better than wasn't a transitive relation. I ran this first by Tom Nagel, who was, in my judgment, along with Derek, one of the two great living moral philosophers of the 20th century. And Derek, I mean, Tom just looked at me and he sort of shook his head very sadly with this kind of mixture of, pity and contempt. And he said, "Oh, Larry, I wouldn't understand what someone meant if they said that all things considered, A was better than B, and all things considered, B was better than C, but all things considered, A wasn't better than C." And he was the great Tom Nagel, and I was like a punk graduate student at the time, and I thought, oh man, I must be an idiot, and I wandered out of his office. But then I took this question to another teacher of mine, a guy named Tim Scanlon, who was at Princeton at the time, later at Harvard. He's a MacArthur Award winner, so-called Genius Award, brilliant philosopher. I ran the same thought by him. I said, Tim, it seems to me that maybe, just maybe, the lesson to be learned from Derek's mirror addition paradox is that all things considered better than isn't a transitive relation. And, he didn't look at me as if I was an idiot the way Tom had, but he basically said, Larry, that can't be. All things considered better than is true by definition. It's just, if you know the meaning of the words, it must be true. And then I ran about Derek, whose paradox it was. I thought, if anyone will appreciate the possibility that there's this incredibly, mind-altering new way of thinking about the world that comes out of his work, it should be Derek. And I ran by Derek, and Derek gave me the same answer. He basically said, Larry, that just couldn't be true. So they basically all told me that, you're an idiot, go home, do something else with your life. And I did put it on hold for a while. But thanks to several students of mine, I did come back to it. I did explore it. And then eventually I came to the view that maybe I was right. And I could even explain what was going on. So I had an explanation, both for why people thought that all things considered better than must be true, but for why it might not actually be true. And this had to do with an exploration about the very nature and structure of the good, which people assume to be one way, but on examination, in fact, it turns out perhaps to be another way. And if it is another way, then there's no reason at all to expect all things considered better than to be a transitive relation. And it is a striking feature that when I started this work, this particular work as a graduate student in 1977, it was universally opposed. I mean, universally opposed. And now when I travel to, the best graduate programs in philosophy in the world, the next generation or two generations forward now, the graduate students, they're all perfectly prepared to accept that all things considered better, there might not be a transitive relation. In a matter of basically 40 years, two generations, among graduate students in philosophy, there's been a radical shift from this is conceptually impossible, or as the great philosopher, former vice chair of moral philosophy at Oxford, John Broome, once told me, it's logically impossible that all things considered better than might be not a transitive relation. And now many, many, many people, including some people in economics, have come to view that, yeah, maybe this is right.
That strikes me as an amazing story on 2 or 3 levels. Let me pick out a couple of reflections and one addition. The addition is that when you came back to this work, and maybe we wouldn't have had all of your brilliant work on inequality had you only come to this conclusion. So maybe there was a silver lining for this. But you sent the write-up of your thoughts to Derek, who, mythology goes, was very busy, had just published, and then took it up halfway up a mountain in India, read it and went, wow, you might be right. I really paraphrase this kind of thing, but actually he had the openness of mind, which you sort of suggest is perhaps a trait of philosophers. I also think Derek has a kind of interesting style of thinking, which maybe I've called perhaps autistic cognitive to some degree as well, but this pursuit of a certain thread of thought. But I thought that was very interesting. I might just mention why I found it kind of so troubling, or at least thoughtful, when I've only relatively recently came across your work around this. And this is because if things aren't transitive, particularly around this, so like you say, it's very easy to see in numbers. In the language of numbers, 3 is bigger than 2, 2 is bigger than 1. So obviously 3 is bigger than 1. And you can see this within the heights of people, right? So this seems to be sort of quite obvious. But we use this as the background for economic utility theory and all of that decision-making theory that actually we alluded to right at the beginning. And so if there is something potentially not always right, or not always situations where we can really hold that, it has really weakened some of my thinking about the moral choices of when you're using utility theory, which is still obviously a very useful decision framework. But I think that relates to my first question, because actually it seems to be the case that it isn't really as all-encompassing as perhaps we would like it to be. It doesn't solve all of these problems for it. And I remember listening to you, you had one very good example around kind of pain as to why you kind of have a thought of experiment on that. But does that still hold for you then, that this does probably not maybe what we'd say, like slightly downweight the idea of how we can use utility theory because of your thinking around transitivity? And are those sort of examples still, has your thinking much evolved around that, or is it kind of evolved as how it was? And maybe you would want to give the quick example around pain or something else, so that people can kind of understand what it might be and why this seems so kind of problematic, if you think that's a good example, or maybe anything else which is kind of easy to understand for this axiom of transitivity.
Sure. Let me say several things. First, I'll give the general answer. I'll give a particular example. So yeah, I mean, it's a striking thing because, economists have always, and I admire economists greatly, and I think their contributions to the progress of humanity has been immense. And I have many very good friends who are economists who I admire greatly, and who have influenced me significantly. Amartya Sen, Angus Deaton, 2 Nobel laureates, John Broome, who was trained under a Nobel laureate as an economist. These are all, very brilliant people. And there's much to be learned from them and from what economics has given us. And expected utility theory is an extremely powerful theory, but it does have a bunch of axioms. These are the premises on which this theory is built. And I have challenged in my book, Rethinking the Good, a good number of its most fundamental axioms. I mean, at least 3. And if the axioms of a theory aren't true, and I think there's very powerful reason to think they're not true, then that theory isn't true. I mean, it's just not. And that should give one great pause of putting too much weight on a theory whose fundamental axioms are questionable. So my thinking about that has not changed. I mean, there are still cases where we all implicitly rely on the axiom of transitivity in our everyday thinking. And there are lots of cases where we rely on sort of standard economic expected utility theory reasoning in our everyday reasoning, but that doesn't mean it's right. It's deeply questionable. Now, let me give a concrete example, and then a little one, I'll just mention one that's a little bit harder to grasp, but here's a concrete example for your audience. So I've been lecturing on the topic of transitivity now for 35 or 40 years, 30 years at least. And I've traveled all around the world, and I will often ask my audience the following question. Suppose that you or a loved one is going to have a certain intensity of pain. So I'm just going to measure that. I'm going to show you a visual diagram. This is the height of this. When I raise this up, is the intensity of the pain. So a certain intensity of pain for a certain duration of time. So if I go like that, that's how long it is. So certain intensity of pain for a certain duration of time. So you or a loved one is going to have a certain intensity of pain for a certain duration, or you or your loved one is going to have a slightly less intense pain. So not quite as intense, slightly less, but it's going to last 2, or 3 or 5 times as long. Okay. And the question is, what do you want for yourself or someone you love? Do you want a certain intensity of pain for a given duration of time? Or do you want slightly less? I mean, just ever so slightly. They barely notice it, but it's a little bit less, but it's going to last 2 or 3 or 5 times as long. That's my first question. Now, I'll just tell you, if your audience is, I should have said, think along with this question. When I ask it, think what you want for yourself or someone you really love, right? Your mom, your daughter, your significant other, whatever. Almost unanimously, people say, I want the slightly more intense pain that's much shorter in duration. It's not literally unanimous, but it's almost unanimous. I then ask my audiences the following question. There's 2 ways your life might go. In one, you're going to live in both lives, there could be very, very, very long lives, as long as you might possibly want. And there's going to be 15 mosquito bites a month for the duration of your life. I came up with this example a long time ago when I lived in Houston, Texas, and we have lots and lots of mosquitoes in Houston, Texas. So I was constantly like scratching the mosquito bites. And, they're annoying. They're not like the end of the world, but they are annoying. And I constantly have mosquito bites on me. So I was thinking, 15 bites a month for the duration of your life. Background, that's part of what goes with living in Houston. But in addition, at one point in this very long life, you or your loved one, your son, your daughter, your significant other, is going to have 2 years of the most excruciating pain humanly imaginable. So everything you've ever seen or heard or read in the worst B, novels or movies about how torture might go, and I don't want to make light of it because, some people have actually gone through this, but, the bamboo shoots under the fingernails, the wax in the eyes, the electrodes, hooked up to your genitals. I mean, it's everything that could possibly be bad. You're being tortured, and you're being tortured like, 20 hours a day until finally you go unconscious, and then they wake you up, and the next day they do it again, and the next day they do it again, and the next day they do it again. And every single day the pain is so intense that you really wish you could die. You just pray, please, Lord, let me die. But you don't. It goes for 2 straight years. But at the end of that 2 years, because this is philosophy, we're allowed to do that, they will give you a pill, and you won't ever remember having gone through this pain. But for the 2 years of your life, it will be the most excruciating pain humanly imaginable. Okay, that's one way your life might go. Now, here's the other. Now, at this point, most of my audience members are thinking, I don't care what the other is, I'm taking that. Right? I mean, you don't have to tell me just what's behind door B. I'm taking door B. I don't want door A. But no, I'm going to tell you what's behind door B because you really have to know. Instead of 15 mosquito bites a month and 2 years of the most excruciating torture humanly imaginable, you will have, wait for it, 16 mosquito bites a month. That's it. Now, which of those do you want for you or anyone you really care about? And here, again, it's virtually unanimous. Human beings say, I want the life of 60 mosquito bites a month. I don't care how long I live, 1 extra mosquito bite a month, right? I'd rather have that than 2 years of the most excruciating torture, humanly imaginable. Okay, so I asked those 2 questions of my audiences. I've asked them around the world. I mean, really hundreds of audiences, thousands of people right now. And virtually everyone, and not everyone, but virtually everyone agrees with the answers they give to these 2 questions. Turns out that the answers that almost everyone accepts, and I'll just add, I believe rightly so, I'll say a tiny bit more about that, are incompatible with the axiom of transitivity. And I'll just say why. Because you'll remember when I said at the beginning, you have a certain duration of pain for a certain certain intensity of pain for a certain duration, or a little bit less intense for 2 or 3 or 5 times as long. I didn't tell you how intense, nor did I tell you the duration. And I didn't need to. Because it turns out this is a generalizable truth. That is, whether it's a really intense pain for a month, a really intense pain for 10 years, or a mild pain for a month, or a mild pain for 10 years, we'd all rather have that pain than one that's a little bit less tense for 2 or 3 or 5 times as long. So it's a general truth, no matter how intense or how long the original duration, we'll rather have that than a little bit, just barely less, but it's lasting much longer. So now you just imagine a world in which everyone starts off with, a long life and 15 mosquito bites, and one of those lives, first life, has 2 years of intense torture. And the next one, just to simplify it, has 4 years of torture, almost as bad, right? 15 mosquito bites and 4 years of torture, almost bad. Not quite as bad, but almost as bad. Everybody says the 2 years and 15 mosquito bites is better than the 4 years of torture, almost as bad, and 15 mosquito bites. Or make it 8 years or 10 years. It doesn't matter. We're just going to simplify it, 2 to 4. We all agree 2 is better than 4 when it comes to torture. Then instead of 4 years of really, really, really bad pain, you have 8 years of pain, almost as bad. Everyone agrees 4 is better than 8. Then you have 8 years of really pretty bad pain, or 16 years of really pretty bad pain, but not quite as bad, but so close. We'd rather have 8 years than 16, and you just continue. Eventually, the pain is getting a little bit less, 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 till at the very end, the pain is the equivalent of a mosquito bite. Now, what we've agreed about is we all agree the first outcome is better than the second is better than the third is better than the fourth is better than the fifth. That continues all the way down. If all things considered better than is a transitive relationship, then the first outcome is better than the last, But the first outcome is one which involves 2 years of excruciating torture and 15 mosquito bites a month. And the last outcome is just 16 mosquito bites a month. And nobody believes that's better. So here we have a conflict. Now, the key is, and really, people who are interested in this topic just need to read the book, Rethinking the Good. But the key is to understand what's going on, to understand what explains this. Because a lot of times people make intransitive judgments. We learned this from the work of Kahneman and Tversky, for which Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, and Tversky would have won the Nobel Prize had he not passed away yet, that people often make, psychologically, they make intransitive judgments because they're making mistakes in their judgment. But I don't think these are cases where we're making cognitive mistakes. I think something else is going on. I think what happens is that there are certain principles that seem relevant and significant for making certain comparisons. And there are other principles that are relevant and significant for making other comparisons. And it turns out that the principles that are relevant and significant for making the comparison between the first outcome and the second and the third and the third and the fourth and the fourth and the fifth, that's what you call an additive aggregationist principle. It basically says, just simplifying, if you have 2 alternatives that differ only slightly, very slightly in terms of, say, pain or pleasure, then quantity matters. So more pain is worse than less pain if the pains are similar in quality. And you call that an additive aggregationist account. For cases like that, we just add up the sum total of pain weighted by the quality times duration. We take the area under the curve, as it were, tells you which is worse. But this is key. There are certain kinds of cases where we accept what I call an anti-additive aggregationist view. And the case I just gave is one, and my Lollipops for Life case on the cover of my book is another. I'll mention that in a second. That's a case where we say, if the difference in quality of pain is sufficiently great, so that the one kind of pain makes a substantial impact on the quality of a person's life, and the other kind of pain makes basically no impact on the quality of their life, then no amount of the second kind of pain is worse than the first. No amount. So there we're rejecting the additive aggregationist account. We're rejecting the view that, well, if only there's enough mosquito bites, eventually they'll be worse than 2 years of intense torture. We say, no, I don't care how many mosquito bites there are. So basically what we're doing is we're using what's called an additive aggregations approach to compare the first alternative with the second, and the second with the third, and the third with the fourth, etc. But we're using anti-additive aggregations approach where we compare the first with the last, and both of those seem right. But then, and this is key, it turns out that if the principles or the factors that are relevant for comparing alternatives vary depending on the alternatives being compared, then there's no reason to expect transitivity to hold. Transitivity only holds if the very same factors are relevant for comparing every comparison, but it turns out they're not. And there's lots, it turns out there's lots and lots and lots of cases of this sort, where actually the factors that are relevant for comparing A with B is one thing, and B with C is another thing, and C with D is another thing, but the factors for comparing A and Z are different. And when that happens, no reason to expect transitivity to obtain. And that's what I eventually saw. And that's what can explain or account for what otherwise seemed logically impossible. We couldn't understand how that could even be the case until I got to the root of what explains how it could be the case, which has to do with the nature and structure of the good. I could say much more about that, but maybe.
Yeah,
let me just say one thing about the.
No, just say
I'll just
definitely read the book for that. I think this is, I don't know, maybe the 18th time I've now read or heard your explanation for it, and I'm still astonished listening to it, and it feels right. So I am troubled a little bit, like you say, that there's a theory that we use and it's probably not true because its axioms are not true. On the other hand, when I think about my creative and artwork, I am less troubled because actually there's a lot, I think, in the endeavor of human creativity and both have been human, which essentially kind of only holds in the moment in these certain circumstances and in these things. So the tools are kind of true, even if they don't have a greater truth. And there's another aspect which I've been thinking about, this idea of like rationality or not rationality, that again, this human brain doesn't work necessarily on all of these prepared pathways like the logic of maths might do. And actually there might be even some neuroscience for why that might be. Do you want to do your other little example, or shall we move on?
Well, we could go on. I was going to give my lollipops for life example as
do that one.
example of an anti-additive aggregations approach, but it is, as I say, the one that was
we've got the picture.
So we might this. What? It's a picture. These are little people, and they're all licking a lollipop, and this is a big person in intense pain. And
if you're only listening, you've got to go and look it up on the web now. Have a look at the picture.
There you go. So the thing about the lollipop for life case is it's one of the many cases where most people accept what's called an anti-additive aggregations view. And what that means is the following. Suppose you had two ways the world might go. In one, everybody lives really an incredibly wonderful, flourishing life. So whatever you think matters for a flourishing life, they've all got it. They live a long time. They have deep loves. They're very creative. They appreciate music. There's all sorts of scientific achievements and accomplishments. There's justice, whatever you want. The lives are filled with them, and everybody has them. And so in terms of all the really weighty things that matter in life, billions of people, they all got them. And in addition, there's a bunch of not so weighty things in life, but that also make life a little bit better. And one of them is that over the course of their lives, these are long lives, everybody gets to lick a lot of lollipops many times, right? Lollipops many times. And that's one way the world might go. And here's another way the world might go. Everybody lives that same kind of life, almost exactly the same. All the things that matter, the high achievements, the good health, the terrific sex, the theater going, everything, whatever you think is valuable in life, it's all there. They're all healthy and they're all happy. But one person suffers the most agonizing life, pain and misery and suffering every single day, day after day after day after day after day after day after day, and then they eventually die. But everybody else who has this incredible great life gets one extra lick of a lollipop over the course of their life. Now, almost everybody you ask that question to says, if you had to choose between those possible outcomes, which would be better? They say the outcome in which everyone has an incredibly great life, but one less lick of a lollipop, rather than the life in which all these people, vast numbers of them, have great lives, one more lick of lollipop, but someone suffers unbelievable agony and dies. So I call that the lollipop for life case. But if one had a simple additive aggregationist approach for everything, well, one lick of lollipop might be only a teeny tiny bit of pleasure. But if you just add up the sum total of people, if only there's enough people, eventually the sum total of pleasure gained from all those individual licks of a lollipop would outweigh the suffering of any single person, no matter how bad, on a simple additive aggregationist approach of the sort that's typically favored by, say, standard utilitarians. But that just seems crazy. That just seems deeply wrong. And there's many examples from literature that try to evidence this kind of a view. The ones who walked away from the omega, or, it's not omega, it's something like that. The ones who walked away. But it just doesn't seem right. Things don't add up in that way. And I have more to say about that, about why they don't add up in that way. But I'll just say one more thing about that, because it's important for people to get their head around what does or doesn't work. When I think about, the pain of a mosquito bite spread out throughout a life, or the extra value of a lollipop spread out over time across many different lives, I claim that those kinds of pleasures and pains don't add up in the way they would need to outweigh the concentrated pains and pleasures that might occur in a single life, say 2 years of torture. And when I think about that, my analogy is roughly like this. Imagine that you have a camel and you have a piece of straw that lands on the camel's back. So there's the camel and there's the straw. And then you go up to it and you blow it off. And then another piece of straw lands on the camel's back. And then I'm going to go back. I'm going to change this example. I'm going to restart that. You have a camel. I want to talk about the straw that broke the camel's back. So you have a camel, you put a straw on the camel's back, and then you add a second piece, and then you add a third piece, and then you add a fourth piece, and a fifth piece, and a sixth piece. It takes a very, very long time, but eventually you'll have tons and tons and tons of straw on the camel's back, and the camel's back will break. That's the additive aggregationist approach. If you add enough straw, the camel's back will eventually break, assuming that straw is all there present at the same time. But suppose instead you have a camel and you put a piece of straw on its back and then you blow it off. And then you put a second piece of straw and then you blow it off. And then you take a third and a fourth and a fifth, but each time you blow it off, the camel's back will never break. It doesn't matter how much straw, it will never break. Well, I think when you have a mosquito bite, one this month, and one next month, and one next month, and one next month, or a lick of a lollipop, one person, and then a different person, and then a different person, and then a different person, those don't add up. That's like the straw on the back that's being blown off each time. Before the second piece of straw comes, the first one's gone. Before the second itch comes, the first one's gone. When the one person has a lick of a lollipop, the other person has one, but they never combine. So there are some kinds of cases where an anti-additive aggregationist approach seems right for comparing outcomes. But importantly, there are other cases where an additive aggregationist approach seems right for comparing cases. And then it just turns out it's easily shown that if certain factors are relevant for comparing A and B and C, but different factors are relevant for comparing A and C, then A could be better than B in terms of all the factors relevant and significant for making that comparison, and B could be better than C in terms of all of the factors relevant and significant for making that comparison. But it does not follow that A is better than C in terms of all the factors relevant and significant for making that comparison, because those factors are different.
That still blows my mind. So I hope everyone listening can ponder that and re-listen to that and go and read the book. I'm going to move on to well, actually, a couple of Peter Singer ideas before getting to the pond, or at least one before his pond analogy. And I have to confess, I found this Singer idea so awkward that I put a little bit less weight to his other ideas on animals and altruism when I first came across it. And this idea has to do with disability, and I think with some of his utilitarian roots. So I hope I don't mangle this, but Singer has proposed that we should allow parents of disabled babies the choice of keeping or ending their lives. Now, Singer has quite a few nuances to his arguments, but I think as a layperson, this seems to me both wrong on both consequentialist and non-consequentialist grounds. Consequentialist because actually you can see examples where this is probably going to have less welfare in the world, and non-consequentialist because it doesn't seem to be the right thing to do. But I never really had a chance to ask a moral philosopher on this. So I wonder if this has been problematic in the world of philosophy as well. You can see, people as brilliant as Stephen Hawking, who had lived very fulfilled lives, wouldn't do that. Disability rights people talk about the social model of disability, which this doesn't also encompass. Things like focusing on systems change and making lives more fulfilled for people. Is it as problematic as we kind of think?
So this is not a topic that I address in any of my books, but I'm happy to address it here. So Peter's views about disability, I mean, they are complex, they are nuanced, and I think they're often misinterpreted. I'm not saying you've misinterpreted them. I do think they're often misinterpreted. The question of whether they're controversial or not, the interesting thing you said is you think that they're controversial on both consequentialist and non-consequentialist grounds. I think they're less controversial on consequentialist grounds than you. I think they're very controversial on non-consequentialist grounds. I think there's lots of reasons why one might or might not worry. But even then, I have to get in. Among philosophers, they're less controversial, even on non-consequentialist grounds, than many people would think. I say among philosophers, there's philosophers and philosophers, and they always say if you have 15 philosophers in the room, 15 opinions about any given issue. In fact, do you mind a funny story? And then I'll come back to this. Oh, maybe I won't. Remind me if you feel like it. There's a character in The Good Place, Chiwa, who can never make up his mind about philosophy. Okay, that character was patterned on my reading group, and I can tell you more about that. But let me talk about the more serious issue about. So the issue for Singer, what makes it so complicated, is it gets down to a variety of questions about under what conditions does a being of any kind have a serious right to life, and for many people, I know how Roe v. Wade was just decided here in the United States, but for many philosophers, a being doesn't have a serious right to life until they have achieved a certain level of development, certain level of psychological development, a whole bunch of other kinds of things. For Kant, you didn't have a serious right to life unless or until you were capable of following a moral law that you prescribed to yourselves. In other words, you had to be a rational being. You had to be a being that was capable of morality. For some people, you don't have a serious right to life unless you're capable of a kind of inner self-consciousness, a life going on the inside where you're aware of who you are, where you have autonomy, where you have plans that are perhaps being frustrated by being treated one way rather than another. For some people, you don't have a serious right to life until you can envisage your future going a certain way, and then have that vision that you have for how your future might go being interrupted by other people who are deciding how your future should go for you instead, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, there's a whole bunch of candidates for under what condition would we say of a being that they have a serious right to life. And most of the candidates that most people take seriously, and this is one of the wonderful ironies about all of this, about how Peter is castigated on one side, but then not credited on another. But for most people, they don't think like a cat or a rat has a serious right to life, or a rabbit has a serious right to life. But in terms of the mental capacities that are currently held by a newborn baby, handicapped or not, and a cat or a rat, one of Peter's points early on is that an adult male cat has those capacities to a greater degree, or a dog, or a cow, or a rat, or a mouse, than a newborn infant. Notice that has nothing to do with the disability per se. That's just true, he thinks, and many philosophers think, about if you first ask the question, under what conditions is one a person, not a human being, but a person, where by person you mean a being with a serious right to life. And Peter tries to ask, what do newborn babies have that newborn chimpanzees don't, or that cats don't, or that mice don't have? What do they have? Now, we can say more about, well, they have a potential that the others don't have, and then we could talk about that. But that potential isn't there now. It's not realized. It might be there in the future. Is that enough? On that view, then, these newborn babies, whether handicapped or not, aren't persons. They don't have a serious right to life. Now, I'm not saying I accept that view. I'm not taking a stand on that one way or the other. But this is a very serious kind of view that's widely discussed and that one has to come to terms with. In virtue of what is it that any being has a serious right to life that would enable us to distinguish, for example, between a newborn infant and an adult cat, if we really think adult cats don't have a serious right to life. And then his point would be, now think, when he turns to the question about what about, handicapped beings, well, that can put a lot of strain on a family. That can put a strain on the other children in the family. It can put a strain, financial strain, emotional strain, all sorts of other strains. Why not, if they don't have a serious right to life anyway, allow the parents to decide for themselves about something that's of such crucial importance to how their lives go and how their families' lives goes and their children's lives might go. Now, if you thought a newborn baby, infant, whether handicapped or not, has a serious right to life, then the fact that it puts a lot of burden on the rest of the family might be irrelevant. Doesn't matter, So I'm sorry, you won't be able to go to an expensive college because we spent all this money, taking care of your younger sister. That's too bad, but she's a person. She has a serious right to life, and that's just the cost you're going to have to pay. But I think his position is more complicated in that, really, at its foundational roots, there's a question of whether any being, any human being before the age of 2, even has a serious right to life. And if the answer is no, even for a healthy newborn baby, then you could see why Peter or others might think, when you're dealing with a seriously handicapped child that might be a huge burden on other members of the family, and whose quality of life, depending on how serious it is, may or may not be significantly high, why not, in that case, give the parents the autonomy to choose what's best for them and their siblings? Now, that's one element of the kind of view in question. There's another element, which is what utilitarians accept, which non-utilitarians don't accept, which is the kind of replaceability argument. On this view, all human lives are replaceable. This goes back to the very first question you asked me about, I could save one person, but it would cost a lot of money. For the same money, I could save 10 other people. Well, this person's life, it's replaceable, as it were. One life versus 10. Kantians and non-consequentialists are going to say, no, you can't think about human lives that way. Human lives aren't replaceable that way. And that's my own view. But for Peter or for other committed utilitarians, we should be neutral between all beings, all sentient beings, including all human beings, and one human being is replaceable by another. So if this human being would have a certain degree, level of success and value in their life, and this person, and you could have 2 others or another person that would, the expected value would be just as high or higher, this person is replaceable by another. So you should enable a parent, allow a parent to not have to support this baby in order to bring another one into existence that would have an equally or better life. That's replaceability thesis. That's a distinctly utilitarian thesis. It's not in general. But now I want to get back to one of the things that which is very important. You pointed to the case of Stephen Hawking. Other people talked about the case of Beethoven, et cetera, though Beethoven wasn't in fact deaf at birth. He became deaf later on, so it's not the perfect analogy. But anyway, suppose he had been deaf at birth, but still capable of creating this great work, Stephen Hawking, others. I mean, what you have to understand here is the form of the reasoning that Peter and others espouse, which this is a kind of reasoning that I often object to in my work, as you know, but it's the form of the reasoning. You know, in legal circles, people say hard cases make bad law. You can't decide the general principles that govern society based on the exceptions, right? You know, based on the fact that as a matter of fact, and again, Stephen Hawking, same case, Stephen Hawking wasn't born with the disabilities that developed later. They came much later. Suppose he had been born with those disabilities, what would the expected value of his life have been? Well, the expected value of his life might have been very, very low. Now, it may have turned out that he was a genius and ended up doing great things, et cetera, but the expected value of his life was quite low. When we make decisions, any kind of decisions, moral decisions, practical decisions, you don't make your decision on the best possible outcome that could ever occur. You make the decision on your most reasonable guesses of what's likely to occur in general in cases of this kind. So when you're choosing between, you know, goes back to the value of expected utility theory, but, you know, you're choosing, you know, which profession you go into. And you go into this profession, you're virtually guaranteed to have a great life. You know, there's almost no downside to it. You go into this profession and you're virtually guaranteed to have a miserable life. But there's a 1 in a billion chance or a 1 in a million chance that you'll have a stupendously great life, a better life than you would have over here. Which should you pursue? Almost every rational person, forget about the morality of it, will say, pursue the one where you're virtually guaranteed to have a great life with no downside. You don't choose the one that is almost certain to lead to terrible outcomes just because there's some small chance, very small, but some chance it might lead to a great outcome. So when people point to, you know, these great lives that have been lived by, you know, people who suffer from serious handicaps, right? That's not necessarily, that might be the hard cases that make bad law. Do we really want to adopt general policies for society, moral or otherwise, based on the exceptions rather than what's predictably going to be the case? Suppose you knew the following. You're going to have 1,000 children born with a severe handicap. And 999 of them, their lives are going to go horribly. It's just going to go horribly. I mean, they'd be ridiculed at school. You know, they're only capable of certain levels, blah, blah, blah. But 1 out of 1,000, their lives could be great. Should you bring the 1,000 people into the world? You know, suppose you could, you know, we as a society, but do you bring 1,000 people into the world knowing that 999 of them are going to suffer greatly because 1 of them might fare really well? That's really what Peter and others are trying to get us to grapple with. They're trying to get us to grapple with really what is the expected value of these lives. And if the expected value of these lives is actually negative, though on rare occasions it's positive, he says, what right do you have to do that? But the key thing I want to get here is there are cases and there are cases and there are cases. You know, there's a difference between a child that's born not normal, but perfectly capable of a happy, fulfilling life. I take it most Down syndrome children have this kind of a life in front of them. And children that really, you know, severe spina bifida, they're likely to be in, you know, pain and suffering and live a short life. And it's never going to turn around or highly unlikely. There are different kinds of cases. And I'm not going to agree with Peter at any point where the argument turns in essence on the replaceability. Well, we could get rid of this model for a newer, improved model. I just don't buy that. But I do think there are other elements that are underlying his view that need to be taken pretty seriously.
Okay, that's given me food for thought. I still find it somewhat troubling, but I understand now the link to his work on animals and sentience better. And I have listened to him, but I actually have found your explanation better. Maybe it's easier to do it when you're doing it on someone else's work where you might not
Yeah.
completely agree with all of them things because you can elucidate the things out from that. So one more then maybe before the pond analogy. I hopefully we'll have time. Again, this is a personal thing, which isn't really in your books either. And it was a little bit I hinted at because I somewhat was troubled by some of Peter's views because of a view that he had, and this actually comes in the work of art. So I had a friend who arguably not a close friend, but a friend who arguably was a great artist and made great work. But it turns out that they also had other parts of their lives which was very troubled and probably horrific. And it ends up that this friend then committed something awful, and they had long running hidden problems, and it didn't end. It didn't end well. And actually, I have their work still on my bookshelves, and I'm a little bit troubled. And this question is often raised with regards to Ezra Pound, and it's a little bit more historic, so we can think it because he had very troubling views. But poets would say his poetry is also very brilliant. Um, do I or should I have to regard their work any differently in the face of other aspects of their lives when I'm thinking about their art or not? I mean, I guess it's going to come to every individual and the weighting of the case and all of that, which I'm considering. But does moral philosophy have anything to say about those sorts of problems? I guess they extend because people can do other horrific things and they have other parts of their lives. And I've read a little bit around that, but I've never had anything which I kind of go, oh, I could really think about it in that way. And I'm assuming that's because of your 50 philosophers and the light bulb type of thing. That there's probably just a huge range of views in that. Is there any easy way of thinking of that, or is the answer is complicated?
So for me, so we've hinted at this already. You hinted at the very beginning, and I've hinted at it in my various responses. But I'm what I call, what other people call, a pluralist about morality. So I think there are many ideals that matter, and I think there are many ideals that matter practically. I think there are many ideals that matter morally. So justice matters, autonomy matters, freedom matters, equality matters, perfectionism matters. All these things matter. The truth matters, I believe. Beauty matters. You know, Keats famously saw the connection between beauty and truth, right? Truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all you know and all you need to know. Something like that. I probably butchered it, but so a very important claim about the importance of truth. Truth itself has its own kind of beauty, and beauty itself has its own kind of truth, a kind of epistemological claim. So I believe there are different values. And I believe that at the end of the day, a person who wants to be a good person has to give proper expression to all of these different kinds of values. So that is almost always going to make, from my way of thinking about the world, any question a complicated question. Because there's rarely a case where I'm going to say, here's the answer. People who are what I call monists as opposed to pluralists, they have a single value. It's the one they care about more than anything else, or the only one they care about. Milton Friedman famously claimed one can care about only one value, and that value is Friedman. No, actually, he said that value is freedom. But anyway, the point was, there's one thing that matters, freedom. Everything else pales. So you assess every single issue in terms of freedom. Well, if you assess every single issue in terms of, and now fill in your favorite value, utility or freedom or perfection, then most of the questions you're going to ask me or yourself are going to have an easy answer. But as soon as you recognize that morality is not that simple, life isn't that simple, art itself isn't that simple. It's fragmented, it's complicated. I mean, you look at Picasso's pieces, many of Picasso's pieces, he's Kafka. I love Kafka, right? The truths that he's revealing, they're not simple, straightforward. You don't get to them in a linear fashion, but they're revealing something really important about his inner psyche, but also about the world and also our relationships, all these kinds of things that you can only sort of see through a distorted lens. There is no clarity there. There isn't clarity to be found. There isn't certainty to be found. Okay, so I believe that morality is extraordinarily complex, and lots of different factors bear on almost every important question. Now, there's some questions that are very nice. They're kind to us, because those are the easy questions where all the values line up, right? Utility favors it, and perfection favors it, and equality favors it, and they all favor it. That makes it a simple answer. But there's so few real world questions, the kind that trouble us, the kind that keep us up at night, that have that feature. There's all these complicating elements. Now, that's the background. Now to the particular question, you asked a specific question. So how should I think about a great poet or a great philosopher, Heidegger or others who are, affiliated with the Nazis, right? Help make Nietzsche. What should we make of Nietzsche if in fact Nietzsche's views were used or misused by the Nazis, blah, 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 blah. I think there are theoretical issues at stake. There are moral issues at stake. There are practical issues at stake. I think insofar as a poet gives us an example of great art that can be inspiring and can teach us about beauty or ourselves or the world or our relationship, it would be a terrible waste of resources to ignore that poem that does that for us. I mean, it would be inefficient if nothing else. On the other hand, do you want to hold this poet up as a paragon of virtue? Be like her, be like him, when there's all this other baggage going on in their lives? The answer to that is no, you don't want to do that. So you may want to, as it were, there's always the old question of, you don't want, I always want to say, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Now, for some people, the kind of case you described, it's a very small baby, and it's a very big bathwater that's filthy and dirty and drudgery and so on. You want to get rid of the bathwater, not the baby. And it's always a continuum, right? Some of these people are, very big babies and only a little bit of water. You really don't want to throw out the big baby just because there was a little water there. And we're facing this issue, as you know, of course, as we try to come to terms with our past and in the West, but not only in the West, and the terrible atrocities that we have helped perpetrate or have perpetrated, or our ancestors did. Do we celebrate or not celebrate? Here in America, Columbus, he discovered America, yeah. And he also committed genocide on all these various things. So now how do we come to terms with that? In the United States, we're trying to, how do we come to terms with these, leaders of the Confederacy? There were all these statues to them, but they were trying to keep slavery as an institution, et cetera. So we need to weigh off, what do we learn from them? What do we not learn from them? What are the costs of just saying, we don't need them? Someone might say, and I could get this argument. Someone might say, yeah, look, Ezra Pound, great writer. But there are plenty of other great writers. Draw on them for their inspiration, blah, 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 blah. You just don't have to talk about him because it's not like he's irreplaceable, right? So if you don't need to talk about someone who's this complicated and has all this baggage, why bother? But the philosopher in me there's always one element of me that cares about the truth. It cares about the truth. And if a poet or a writer or a philosopher has truths that they've expressed, I think we should hang on to those. But we should be very clear that what we're hanging on to is the truth and not the speaker of the truth. That would be my own way of thinking about it.
Okay.
But I certainly can see there's the theoretical case to be made, and then there's the practical case, because human beings aren't so good at compartmentalizing. Suppose if we say, look, here's what we want to do. We want to continue to teach these controversial figures, but we're going to do it with a sign at the beginning of class. And all it says is, look, they did a bunch of really nasty things. Ignore all that. Just pay attention to the poetry or the story or whatever like that. If you say that, are we going to do it? Or is this other stuff going to infiltrate? Is it going to have an impact? You say don't pay attention to it, but even when you say don't pay attention to it, you start paying attention to it. But look, the old saying from the Bible, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. This is my point about the big baby with a little bit of water or the small baby with, if you go back in history, all of the people we teach are complicated because they all come out of a historical period where nasty views were held, and they're part of, they're part of those nasty views.
That is helpful though to think about it in that way, and perhaps confirms my nudging towards a sort of pluralist type of view as well. So let's go to Peter Singer's Pond. That's part 1 of the podcast. For Larry's critique of certain effective altruism ideas, including disanalogies with Peter Singer's Pond, developmental aid skepticism, and worries about long-termism, please go on to part 2. Thanks. If you appreciate the show, please like and subscribe, as it helps others find the podcast.